We humans depend on our natural environment and get our resources from her for survival. Aside from humans, our environment takes good care of its inhabitants since life flourished on this planet. However, the rise of civilization started to have a concept of power and status. Overconsumption of resources became a common practice without thinking of its consequences. For us to promote healthy society, we must define and look deeper into the natural world. In this lecture, we will discuss our interconnection with each other and the environment. Good day everyone, I am Sir Jonas and I will be your guide for this lecture. Next slide, please. Okay, biodiversity is the contraction of two words, biological and diversity. Biodiversity refers to the number, variety, and variability of living organisms. Next slide, please. Take note that the word biodiversity is a vast term. Let us try to review some concepts about biodiversity. Number one, living organisms are numerous, from small to large creatures, and are compared of several species or groups. These organisms interact with one another and with non-living things. Number two, living organisms are abundant in habitats, supplying all the foods and requirements that they need. Number three, organisms have different growth and metabolic characteristics, unique to a particular group and variable reproductive patterns, which have some have more species while others have less. Excuse. Number four, biodiversity is essential to human survival. Without biodiversity, life can be dull and boring. With scarce resources, there would not be enough food and medicine. Next slide, please. Okay, biodiversity has three components or levels. We have ecosystem, biodiversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Next slide, please. Okay, let us try to define what an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a geographic area where living organisms interact with each other and their environment. Living organisms include the following groups: fauna, flora, and microbes. Flora instead. On the other hand, these biotic or living factors are also interacting with non-living things or the physical components in their environment. One good example of an ecosystem would be a forest. Can you think of some examples of living and non-living things inside the forest? Okay. Ecosystem biodiversity is the largest and most visible component of biodiversity. It is significant since we are dealing with multiple ecosystems in an area. Hence, please do remember that this ecosystem may be interacting with each other. Next slide, please. Now let's proceed with the next component of or level of biodiversity, the species diversity. It is the kinds of plants, animals, and other living things present in an area. These species rely on each other for survival in simple food chains or complex food webs. Please do remember that when we are talking about biological organisms, the word species is singular and plural at the same time. Next slide. The last component or level of biodiversity is genetic biodiversity. Take note that the same species could have differences from each other. Our best example would be the differences shown by our pets. Our dogs would often show differences from each other even though they are of the same species. Variation in size, color, and behavior are characteristics that would help this species to survive in changing environments. Our DNA, particularly our genes, dictates these characteristics. Next slide, please. Several factors negatively affect biodiversity. These effects may be at an organismal level or on a larger scale, at an ecosystem level. So, loss of biodiversity can be worst result of numerous anthropogenic activities. These activities includes number one, urbanization, overpopulation, agricultural land development, logging, and number 5, river damming, as well as use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. Each of these destroys habitats in one way or another. Next slide. Pollution naman, on the other hand, is a condition in which there is an abnormal increase in the concentration of naturally occurring environmental compounds such as heavy metals, radionuclides, nitrates, phosphates, cyanides, agricultural waste, sewage, pathogens, gases, particulates, and more. Their higher concentration can make an environment unfavorable for the survival of a particular organism. Next slide, please. Non-native species or invasive alien species or invasive species are species introduced accidentally or intentionally to a place that is not part of their natural habitat. Their introduction to the local community could become a threat to other organisms as they become invasive, especially if they have an ecological niche similar to the native ones. These species may outcompete the native species for nutrients and food, leading to the latter's population decline and extinction. So, do you think some invasive species in our country na talagang nagkaroon ng malaking effect sa environment na napuntahan nun? Okay. Next slide, please. The gradual increase in the world's temperature also threatens biodiversity. We have global warming. This entails the following: the meltdown of icebergs in polar regions that leads to sea level rise. Number 2 is the increase in the number of rainfalls, too hot summers and too cold winters, frequent grass and forest fires, and changes in sea temperature. This remains true especially to species that are incapable of adapting to this changing environment. Next slide. Any form of abuse to flora and fauna threatens biological diversity. Collecting them may threaten their proliferation. Gathering these organisms, especially the endangered one, for trading is an act punishable by law. RA 9147. Okay? So, we have overhunting, which is an activity that results in a sharp reduction of species population or harm to wildlife. It is the relentless chase for wild or game animals to kill or catch them for economic or personal gains or food. On the other hand, illegal logging is the harvest, transportation, purchase, or sale of timber in violation of laws. Illegal wildlife trade is estimated to be a multi-billion-dollar business involving the unlawful harvest and trade in live animals and plants or parts and products derived from them. Next slide. Okay, so there are several ways on how to help our biodiversity. There are threats, but there are ways. One way of conserving our resources and rescue the endangered species is to allow propagation using cell tissue culture. Okay? Next slide. Cryopreservation naman, on the other hand, is a non-lethal storage of organelles, cells, tissues, or bone biological constructs at ultra-low temperature. This technology enables the conservation of germoplasm or germplasm. The Philippine Carabao Center use this currently. Okay? Next slide, please. So advancement in molecular biology and genetics, so it helps analyze individual strains of our organisms, identify species, and predict future phenotypes. So those are the different ways on how us to conserve our biodiversity, and also in our little ways as a youth, dapat magkaroon tayo ng burden to use social media as a platform for helping our country, helping our environment to be conserved. Hindi ma-overexploit ang mga natural resources, as well as kung paano tayo makakapag-conserve through properly disposing our garbages, as well as educating people. Okay? So I hope you learned a lot from this lecture. Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye-bye.